I'm not sure if I need to do this in America, but in India people always do this, assuming the electricity probably isn't off, which meant that everybody in the audience laughed, which is a good start. Thank you very much. Welcome everyone to this session, which as you just heard is Neighbours in Arms, the Pressler Amendment, dealing with how to, or maybe how not to, stop rogue countries developing nuclear bombs, and I hope nobody from the rogue country in question is about to walk out. And how far Washington's foreign and allied policies are controlled by a cabal often called the military-industrial complex of vested interests. On the platform, as you've heard, we have Larry Pressler, the author of the book that gives this session its name, a distinguished former senator who calls that cabal, which we'll be coming on to later, the octopus, a new name, I think, which hasn't been used before. And Shashi Tharoor, a former Undersecretary General of the United Nations, which hat I'm going to try to persuade him to adopt every now and again during this conversation. He's now a prominent member of the Parliament in India and a prolific author who tomorrow is discussing his latest book on how we, the Brits, ruined India while we were there for those couple of centuries. He's also the chairman of India's Parliamentary Foreign Affairs Committee, so a number of hats. And I'm a journalist, and I've lived in India for about 20-25 years. Larry, let's start with you. The aim of what became known as the Pressler Amendment, introduced by Ronald Reagan in 1985, was to give the president a vehicle through which to stop aid and defense supplies to Pakistan if it was developing nuclear weapons, or if it had them. I typed here, how do you broadly assess its success or failure? And I think I should say, how do you assess its failure? Because it didn't work.
Yes, well, I say in my book that we did not succeed, first of all, but we're still trying. And I think the effort, though, was successful to some extent, although the state of the world is in Korea and Afghanistan and Pakistan and elsewhere would indicate that we have a lot of work to do. But let me say, first of all, I'm very honored to be here with my colleagues here on the stage, and I've got one of John Elliott's books here, of which he starts out saying, Jugad Chalta Hai, which means somehow it's going to work out.
It means you fix it and it'll all be all right on the
Okay.
night, which I guess some people would say Pakistan was doing with the nuclear. Which
Yes.
I guess some people would say Pakistan is doing with the nuclear bombs.
Yes. Well, let me say that we are struggling forward in the United States. With our country, we have a lot of problems. Obviously, we had some problems in St. Louis last night, I guess some civil rights demonstrations. So all countries have to struggle forward, and India has done a good job of doing the same thing. But I think that we do have a change in Washington in the terms of President Donald Trump and his Secretary of State, Mr. Tillerson, and Lisa over at the White House, and others. It seems that for the first time our government is moving, and Secretary Tillerson over at the Defense Department in particular, is moving us towards not trying to buy off Pakistan with just giving them more weapons.
Larry, could I interrupt you? Could we go on to that later?
Okay.
Could we do first the amendment and how it came in and how you assess it, what happened in those subsequent years?
Okay. It came in because I and several others were trying to find a way to promote nuclear non-proliferation, and this was a part of a broad effort. At that time, believe it or not, Brazil and South Africa were trying to get a nuclear weapon, and Senator John Glenn and I and others decided to actually sponsor some legislation. Most people just make speeches about it. It's very dangerous to really sponsor legislation and vote on it. So we got this amendment regarding shutting off aid to Pakistan if the president could not certify that Pakistan had a weapon. And this was always a struggle with the CIA getting the story straight. But finally, under George H.W. Bush, the Pressler Amendment was enforced for several years, and it was effective. And I think that had it stayed in effect, it would have, Pakistan would not have developed a nuclear weapon. I believe that very sincerely.
Shashi's sitting beside you. No, not yet. Shashi's wagging his head skeptically. So I think you need to put some meat on that bone. Before he has a go, what happened that makes you so happy with the result?
What happened was Bill Clinton, who was always talked like a nuclear non-proliferationist, and his colleague Al Gore came into office and immediately totally reversed.
No, before that, what was the success?
Well, the success was, I think it was successful during the years it was enforced.
Before Clinton came in?
That is correct. That's my judgment.
But can you, Shashi's sitting there giggling.
Okay.
Can you explain how?
Well, of course, one cannot prove this, but I'm told that Pakistan was very startled for the first time. They couldn't do the joint military exercises with us. A lot of military and economic aid was actually cut off, and it caused them to pause. But the minute Bill Clinton was elected, they knew he would lift it, and he did. And it was totally out of character for what he had said in his campaign.
But you do say in the book, Pakistan took our aid and ignored the Pressler restrictions.
Well,
page 129.
Yes, yes. Of course, I'm very frank in the book but they didn't totally, I go on there to say that there were some steps taken by the Pakistani government that caused them to back up a little bit. And Ambassador Haqqani, who has written a foreword to that book also, was there in Pakistan. He was a Pakistani ambassador to the United States. He said the enforcement of the Pressler Amendment caused Pakistan to pause their internal system and really rethink if they were really going down the nuclear road. And I tend to agree with Ambassador Haqqani.
Let's give Shashi a chance. Shashi's also, I should have mentioned, but we had a long enough list of all his achievements. He's also written a preface to this book. Right. So he and Haqqani together saying what a great book it is. And now, Shashi, you can say something different.
No, I'm not going to say anything different. I'm a great admirer of Larry's, and I think that the Pressler Amendment shows that he had his heart in the right place. But inevitably, because in the US there is a convention that the executive makes foreign policy and the legislature can at best influence it, it became a tool to serve the executive rather than to serve the actual goal of the amendment. In other words, what happened, it gave the executive the out, that they could certify. So it was not that the amendment immediately had a direct impact on Pakistan. It's when the executive wanted to turn the screws on Pakistan, they could point to the amendment and say, look, if you carry on like this, we cannot certify, and then you won't get any aid. The Pakistanis would then scramble to give the executive, the administration, just enough so they could certify, and every year, indeed, they did certify, with the result that the aid continued to flow. So to that degree, I would have to say the amendment was not successful. It was successful in putting Pakistan on notice that now there was a new legislative instrument available should an administration want to be tough on them. But no US administration, particularly during the years when the Soviets were still in occupation in Afghanistan, was going to be turning the screws on Pakistan beyond a point. So it had a very limited utility, and all evidence suggests it did not slow down the Pakistanis in their development of the nuclear weapons that they eventually revealed to the world only in '98, but clearly had prepared and had ready some time in advance.
And it wasn't just nuclear weapons, of course. It was also defense equipment and other supplies which should have been curbed.
That's
and
right.
Were allowed through.
For a long time, our United States policymakers have seemed to believe that if we gave Pakistan more and more weapons, they would like us more and more. And just the opposite was true. But in a lot of this is very difficult foreign policy making, and President Trump is now, and of course the Prime Minister of India and elsewhere, are faced with a situation where an analogous situation up in North Korea where we really don't have any military options. We say we do. And where President Obama, when he drew an orange line or a yellow line or something for Syria, he really didn't have realistic military options. And that is where this is the toughest subject in the university, because when you get players such as Pakistan and North Korea, it is very difficult to control them. And we were trying to do so. Now, when George H.W. Bush first came into office, he did enforce the Pressler Amendment. It was enforced. There was all the joint military exercises with Pakistan were shut off. The Pakistanis didn't come over to the United States for military training. All of our food programs were shut off in Pakistan. It was a jolting experience for Pakistan there for a few years. Now, I think George H.W. Bush enforced it because he felt he had been lied to directly by the Pakistani leaders, and also he thought that it would help in heading off a nuclear weapon or weapons in the subcontinent. And in this whole area, we can point a lot of fingers around at ourselves and others, but it was a legislative effort for Congress to finally do something about this rather than just make speeches. And it had a lot of teeth in it had it been fully enforced.
Let me just point out briefly that yeah, I mean, Bush 41, as it were, did use the Pressler Amendment because once the Soviets withdrew from Afghanistan in 88, 89, just as Bush was coming to power, Pakistan seemed to matter a little less to Washington than it had the previous years. So suddenly he could be serious about certification, which Reagan felt he couldn't afford to be.
And then the terror thing built up later and became another block to things happening. And there seemed to be an incredible idea that by supplying conventional weapons, Pakistan wouldn't bother to develop nuclear ones. I mean, a bit of logic that I don't, well, and I'm sure you don't subscribe.
Even the conventional weapons were cut off during the early days of George H.W. Bush. But the point of the whole matter was it was an effort to, we were groping for a way to stop the spread of nuclear weapons. And in fact, both South Africa and Brazil backed off. They saw that some activity in Washington and that there was some consequences, and that they backed off for lots of other reasons too. But it was an era when we were searching for a solution. It did not work out in the end, but I think it caused pause in some other countries to get nuclear weapons. But I must say, as I say in my book, I think that the octopus, the military-industrial state, so dominates the U.S. Policymaking that it's very difficult to overcome. Now, we do see some results in the Pressler Amendment today with Secretary Tillis over at the Department of Defense. He has issued orders coming from the President to reduce certain military shipments and credits to Pakistan now. So we're seeing some progress again, but this certainly won't solve the underlying problem.
You're jumping my story a bit. I'm going to take you back a step again to Clinton, which is what you were trying to talk about a few moments ago. So in 1990, Bush blocked aid, defense sales continued, and then in 1992, Pakistan admitted it had the capabilities from 1989, and then Clinton comes in and begins to wipe the whole thing away, and you can't believe it. You can't believe that he would do that, and you suggest that he was playing footsie, and this brings us on to the octopus, though I'd rather still leave the octopus for a few more minutes. You suggest that he was playing footsie with potential donors to the Clinton Foundation, that in fact he was doing all the things that you and he disapproved of in order to whip up money for his foundation that would give him part of his life later.
Yep. Well, all of Washington is driven by money, and we make a lot of our foreign policy now in law firms and lobbying firms and foundations that are outside of the traditional foreign policy formulating areas, such as working with the United Nations or the State Department Policy Planning Bureau or the congressional hearings. Each ambassador who comes to Washington from India or Pakistan has to hire several law firms and lobbying firms, I think, and maybe our ambassador will correct me here if I'm wrong, but...
you say somewhere that every Indian ambassador chooses a new PR firm.
Well, it seems that way to me, but
that's what you say in the book.
I'm not...
Sorry, I keep on forgetting to do this.
Yes, I think that is correct. Depending on who's in office, it appears to me, and I list them in my book.
You list them in the book.
Well,
some of the firms.
Yes. So this is unfortunate, I think, but it's maybe by necessity because we do have terrorists. We do have a domestic terrorist problem. We do need the military-industrial state to some extent. But the day, and I've known Bill Clinton long before he and I were in politics from the Rhodes Scholarship connection. And he's a charming, good guy, but he calculates everything else out for Bill Clinton. And that whole thing about dropping the Pressler Amendment was driven by potential contributions to the Democratic campaign committee or to the future of Bill Clinton. That's in my opinion. I'm being a little sarcastic here, and I could be criticized equally on probably a smaller scale for this or that. But I just could not understand why Bill Clinton and Al Gore, I asked Al Gore once, I thought you guys were nuclear non-proliferationists. And he just kind of shrugged and smiled meekly. But as only Al can do when he doesn't want to say anything. So that's the only explanation I can give for Bill Clinton not being, he should have been excited about the Pressler Amendment.
Let's look at it more broadly and bring in North Korea. I mean, Shashi, what lessons are there to be learned from this exercise, and then move on to where we are now with North Korea, and have a UN hat on rather than an Indian hat on, as if you were still at least the Undersecretary General?
Difficult for me to have the UN hat in this context, not only because I'm now in Indian politics, but even while I was at the UN, I had a very unfashionable point of view within the UN. I was not in the disarmament area, but in the peacekeeping area, so I dealt with the consequences of many of these problems.
And then in the Secretary General's office.
Yes, indeed. But at the same time, I found the Non-Proliferation Treaty fundamentally flawed. I think it's the last vestige of apartheid in international relations. It basically involves a bunch of countries saying, we're entitled to have something that the other countries are not. And that kind of system is extremely difficult to sustain intellectually. The only way in which one could have bought onto it, as briefly people did in the 60s, was if you were prepared to suspend disbelief and assume that the nuclear powers were sincere in their professed statement at the beginning of the Non-Proliferation Treaty that this was a step towards comprehensive universal nuclear disarmament. But when in fact they didn't disarm, they kept developing more sophisticated nuclear weapons for themselves, while taking on upon themselves the moral authority to stop other countries from doing what they had done to acquire what they had. I found it impossible to sustain either morally, ethically, or legally. So to my mind, the Non-Proliferation Treaty is amoral. It cannot be supported on any moral basis. Either everybody disarms, or you accept the fact that the same logic that applied to you can apply to other countries. And that's why I'm sorry to say, I mean, North Korea formally denounced the Non-Proliferation Treaty and pulled out of it. India and Pakistan never signed it at any stage. So they are not actually in violation of international law, but you cannot be in violation of a treaty commitment you did not undertake. So in the case of India, to be very frank, we have never proliferated in the sense that we have never sent out nuclear technology to any other country. We have developed it indigenously and we've kept it to ourselves. And we've actually, I mean, I thought the government of 1998 was unwise to test and reveal a capacity that was always going to be more effective if it was suspected but not revealed. It would have been a very good thing to keep under wraps, in my view. But that, again, is a personal view. I just want to stress that, that when you think in terms of what Larry was trying to do, I saw it as a useful foreign policy tool towards a state that had indeed not only been lying to the Americans, as he put it, but had fundamentally a militaristic ethos. I mean, I've said before, and I'll say it again, in India, the state has an army. In Pakistan, the army has a state. And the army, no army of any country in the world disposes of a larger share of that country's GDP or that country's government budget than the Pakistani army. And this is then supplemented by billions of dollars of American assistance. It was $3 billion in the 1970s in those days' money. This last decade, it's been $11 billion, and it continues to flow. So since all money is fungible, the money may not directly go to nuclear proliferation, but it certainly enables the well-financed military to divert other monies to purposes that the world community may not be happy with. So the Pressler Amendment as a foreign policy tool, great, but then you need the administration to have the moral courage or the political muscle to decide to use the Pressler Amendment to stop the Pakistani military having its own way. No administration, with the exception of 1 year of Bush 41, ever had the courage to use it. Now, whether it's because, as Larry says, they had financial or other motives, or whether it's because they felt their dependence on Pakistan meant they had to give the Pakistani military a free pass, that's a matter of opinion and difference of opinion. But to my mind, it's very clear that the amendment was not used as it could have been.
I might say that a lot of this conversation places a great deal of burden on the United States. And I think we're entering a new period in the formulation of foreign policy in the United States that will see a streak of isolationism. It comes through in some of President Trump's speeches. It certainly comes through in several Senate campaigns that are going on now. And also, the United States, we're running out of money, really, this time. It's for real. The deficit that we're going to hit, we've raised the debt ceiling, but the next appropriations year is going to be very difficult because of the size of our deficit. And we are faced with kind of a withdrawal from international activities on a partial scale, I think, in the next few years. So other countries will have to step up a little bit in dealing with places like Pakistan and North Korea. For example, Germany does a lot of business there. The Swedes and Danes sell a lot of arms there. The United States is not the only country in the world. England certainly got a lot of capability. I hope to see these, I think we're going to see a recline or a retreat by the United States from a lot of these leadership on a lot of these issues in the next few years, whoever is president.
Shashi, somebody metaphorically coming in from outer space and looking at all this might say, well, why, and I'm not suggesting this as a logical question if you know the history, but might say, well, why didn't the world try to embrace Pakistan as in the way that India eventually got embraced, and trying to manage their nuclear weapons with them rather than trying to threaten them with no aid and no, I suppose the answer is because they have an army with a state rather than a state with an army.
Yeah, I mean, it's also that Pakistan frankly had
could it have been handled better?
Well, there's also the fact, which we can't get around, that Pakistan, in fact, did acquire their capacity through very dubious means. A.Q. Khan stealing technology from the Dutch labs that he worked in, the nuclear bazaar that he was trying to conduct with North Korea, Libya, and so on and so forth. I mean, the world's intelligence services, particularly the US, were very much aware of what was going on. And they did need to try and curb this behavior. Nobody had those concerns about India. I mean, they were spying just as much on us, I'm sure, as they were on our neighbors, but they could see that the Indian establishment was behaving. The Indian nuclear capacity is completely under civilian control. The military has a very, very marginal say, if at all, on its existence, its deployment, the strategic doctrine underpinning it. The military is a very marginal player in all this in India. Whereas in Pakistan, the military runs it. The civilians hardly have any say. So I think it's entirely appropriate to have two different yardsticks to judge these two programs and to respond differently to them, as the Pressler Amendment did.
And of course, Pakistan was in touch with North Korea on development.
Absolutely, and it's North Korean missile technology that the Pakistanis have been using. In fact, these names, these Pakistani missiles, blood-curdlingly named after assorted Muslim invaders of the subcontinent, are all actually the Nodong and the Tepodong and all of these North Korean missiles rebaptized, if that's the word. It's quite amusing. I mean, they literally have been buying their technology from the North Koreans, and it is suggested supplying some nuclear technology back.
And China's role as well.
Well, China's been the midwife of this entire relationship.
Since when?
Since North Korea was for a while a wholly owned subsidiary of the Chinese Communist Party. So very clearly they were doing a lot of things. It was China that told North Korea to take Pakistan seriously and to work with it.
You were about to say something there.
I was going to say that also underlying all this is something I'm going to try. I'm going to India this coming Friday for a tour. Penguin's sending me around with my book.
Which you're launching in Bombay next week, I think.
That's right, and I really don't know what that means, launching, but we're going to make it for sale.
Probably you're going to unwrap it, untie
yes,
string
yes.
around it.
But in any event, there are many members of Congress of the American Parliament who want Congress to be more involved in foreign policy. In modern times, most of it's been left to the executive because Congress doesn't have the courage to vote on a lot of it. But Lindsey Graham of South Carolina today wants resolutions on Pakistan and the use of force and so forth. But John Glenn was of that group, and he was my Democratic co-sponsor, and so for a while it was the Glenn-Pressler and then Pressler-Glenn Amendment known in the Congress. But our hodgepodge, our Constitution and our traditions, it's so hard to explain even to ourselves on different issues, but the Congress is really supposed to take the lead in foreign policy, strangely enough, if you read the Constitution. But it hasn't worked out that way. So this was an effort. The Pressler Amendment was an effort on the part of Congress to actually do something, and we make all these speeches and so on and so forth. So, and as we move through the North Korean matter and the Pakistan matter, we have all these gallant statements, but very little action from Congress. And this was once when Congress did act, I'm proud to say.
So now moving on to what you were trying to talk about, wanting to talk about earlier, which is President Trump getting tougher with Pakistan. On August the 21st, singling out Pakistan for supporting what he called agents of chaos, violence and terrorism. And the Financial Times yesterday had a headline, US weighs dropping Pakistan as an ally. I have to say I read it and I couldn't actually find anything in the story to substantiate the headline, but even though it's my old newspaper. But there we go. How far is this going to go?
Well, I think President Trump's presidency has been much better carried out than it has been interpreted in the national media or in the tweets and all this noise. President Trump has appointed a cabinet that is probably the most professional in history. You might disagree with the Secretary of Interior, but he's been a Navy SEAL and went to a PhD from Harvard or something. President Trump is not afraid of appointing people smarter than himself, and he says that. But he's got a very good secretary. He's got a very good Secretary of State in Tillerson, a man of great international experience. You pull together some of those oil rig deals up in the Arctic, and it's not easy. And he himself has done, the president has gotten very good marks for his handling of the flood, although you don't get that through the national media. But among people of public administration, and I serve on the board of a school of public administration, and so his administration is moving forward better than is generally acknowledged. But especially so in the Defense Department and the State Department, in my opinion. Now, some people say, well, some of those slots aren't filled, but that could be on purpose because you've got them filled with acting career people. And I think that Tillerson likes to have the acting career people running the show rather than just a whole sea of political appointees over there in the State Department or in the Defense Department. Now, how is this going to play out with Pakistan? It has played out to severe cutbacks, and I know that the story wasn't quite complete yesterday, but earlier the Secretary of Defense announced substantial cutbacks in military cooperation and aid to Pakistan.
Since when, if I can interrupt you, Pakistan says it's had no details of what America requires?
Well,
that was a government spokesman yesterday.
Yeah, I don't know. I can't attest to that, but that's what the Secretary of Defense said. And
John, if you don't mind me chipping in here,
I think going to say that, Larry, what's your?
No, I mean, I think that when you ask how far will it go,
yes,
it will not go as far as we would like in India, for example, because as long as there are American troops in Afghanistan, and as we know, President Trump has just announced that he's going to actually be sending a few more folks there without specifying the numbers, Pakistan will enjoy a certain American dependence that one cannot get away from. I remember a grizzled old American general saying to me in my UN days that, you know, rank amateurs discuss tactics, other amateurs discuss strategy, true professionals discuss logistics. And logistics are what Pakistan has got over the Americans. You can't get supplies into the Americans in Afghanistan without the cooperation of the Pakistanis and through Pakistani territory. End of story. As long as that is there, you are never going to be able to see the Pakistanis cut off by the Americans. It's not going to happen. So there will be these little gestures, but I suspect they've been nibbling away at the edges.
What realistically can you hope for? What's
frankly,
the most that you could expect America
we
to
may
do,
well be
given all
seeing
those
it.
constraints?
We may well be seeing it. There may be no more than we're seeing right now. There'll be some rhetorical language that serves to put the Pakistanis on guard that they're no longer the apple of the Washingtonians' eyes. But beyond that, and beyond a few relatively marginal cuts, which will not have a serious impact, for example, on Pakistan's capacity to continue to wreak havoc and play mischief with both Afghanistan and India, beyond that, I don't see much else happening.
Well, I do not necessarily defend everything the Trump or Obama administration has done. I disagree with him. For example, I am a Vietnam veteran, and our biggest mistake is to put American troops on the ground in any country, in my opinion, as a result of my personal experiences. So I'd be very much against any more troops going into Afghanistan, but I've read that that may well happen, although it hasn't yet. But I just heard in the news that President Trump is going up to the UN meetings and will be speaking there. And he will have, I hope other countries chime in. He does learn on the job, and he admits to it. And you might well be surprised and pleased, but there are no easy solutions that I can see at this point regarding Pakistan, except just don't give them any more weapons. And if they want to go be allies with China, let them go. This business of trying to give them more arms and keep them in our camp is just a basic mistake. And that is true, probably. Historically, when the Russians left Afghanistan, our administration didn't have as much reason to be there. But all that's history at this point. But I hope other countries of the world will step in and help out a little bit with Pakistan, because I read and see a lot of trade and aid and other things going on between the Northern European and the Central European countries and Pakistan, and I think we need a little help.
Moving on now towards the octopus, despite the nice things you've been saying about Tillerson and Mattis, the two secretaries, you do say we seem to be making more foreign policy in law firms and consulting firms than we are in traditional State Department and congressional forums.
Yes, and
do you?
And maybe that's not all bad, some people say, but a lot of the so-called India-U.S. new agreement, which you would know much more about than I and most people in this room would, I see that as little more than a major arms sale agreement. I don't think that that will help the average people of India very much. If Strobe Talbot and all the boys over at Brookings boast about what a great agreement that was, why didn't they do something about agriculture or health or well, there's just a whole area, there's a whole series of areas on the human level that we could interact more with India and lots of other countries on, Peace Corps-like activities and so forth, and that just seemed to, that whole India, and I'm not afraid to say that I think the government of India has some great challenges to meet, as we have great challenges to meet, as the news last night indicated. So we're working on race, but the treatment of minorities and people with a lesser voice in society in both countries. But in any event, it is much, and I recommend in my book that Pakistan be declared a terrorist state, or whatever we want to call it, to put it into a category that it would not get any of that aid or trade, and I think that would be in our interests.
Okay. You described, moving on to the octopus, you described the octopus in your book as the great-grandchild of the military-industrial complex, the pestiferous beast that President Eisenhower named in his farewell address to the American people in 1961. In that historic speech, Eisenhower warned, "In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex, the potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power, etc., etc." In your book, you name that, and you name that as one of the main reasons why the amendment didn't work. So without going back into the amendment, tell us about the octopus.
All right.
It's not only government and defense companies, it's also Brookings and and
Kennedy School of
Carnegie
Government.
and others, and you even make Prime Minister Modi part of it because he hired APCO, the PR firm, in order to build up Gujarat, so he could become Prime Minister. You bring in Brookings in India. There's this whole... Now, without wanting to be too much conspiracy theory oriented, and many people might say, well, we all know about the military-industrial complex, it's been there for years. Why are you pinpointing it? Why are you building almost a quarter of your book on the octopus?
Well, because it isn't just in foreign policy, but it's in domestic policy. I'm very concerned that our democracy is threatened by the fact that since Eisenhower's warning on the military-industrial state, it's gotten bigger and bigger. And this is the Pentagon, plus all the arms contractors, plus all the people that get contributions from them, plus the foundations that rely on them, plus the universities. Basevich, the professor up at Boston University, has classified several of the universities as being part of the octopus, or the arms industrial state. What happens is we have every year in Congress an arms appropriations bill, and it passes completely funded. People add on stuff every year. We have systems of weapons that are being built that the Pentagon doesn't even want, but because they provide jobs and connections in certain states, they're added on. And this is probably happening in India also. But I see the U.S.-India, the so-called new treaty or the new arrangement, as mostly an arms sale.
This is the nuclear deal for civil nuclear power in India.
And as I say in my book, we really haven't done the work to get... I'm all for peaceful use of nuclear material, but you got to persuade people that they'll let a plant be built nearby, and that includes in the United States. We can't even build a nuclear...
And you make the point that that's led to the arms deals which America's now been able to do with India. Do you therefore think that nuclear deal should not have been done?
Well, I wish it had included a lot of social exchanges in agriculture and health, and maybe both ways, because we need some help ourselves on a lot of things in our inner cities and elsewhere. But overall, it was probably the right idea, but it's really not a nuclear deal so much as it's an arms sales deal. And President Obama's last trip to India was an arms sale trip. It wasn't a diplomatic trip.
Well, that's good for America if you're selling the arms.
Well, yes, it is. The military-industrial state will sell more weapons. That's what I'm talking about in there.
And Shashi, in your foreword to the book, you talk about the octopus. In fact, you endorse it. It also successfully sought aid and assistance from a sophisticated lobby, the octopus, that's available for hire at a price, buying favor in the capital of the world's greatest power, winning support ostensibly to fight terror, but really to satisfy its own peculiar interests.
Well, I mean, I'm writing a foreword to Larry's book, and he makes the case far more compellingly than that sentence you just read does. But I mean, the fact is that, Larry does include a lot of emanations of the American establishment in that definition. And so, as you said, he even goes so far as to include the university establishment that underpins this.
Yes.
Some of the career American ambassadors would be card-carrying members of Octopus, as far as Larry is concerned.
Bob Blackwell, Frank Wisner.
And so on. And so, in a sense, from an Indian policymaker's point of view, the question we have to ask is he describing an insidious creature that is distorting the American state, or is he describing the way America works? And to some of us, the latter is a more useful way of dealing with the establishment. This is how they are. We better not worry about whether they're doing it for their own bottom lines. This is the way it's going to get done, and if we want to work with them, we'll have to play their game. So I'm not sure that I would reproach the Indian policymakers for going along with this. I mean,
you've got no option.
Well, exactly, because we have no option. Because this is the way the American system functions and is perceived by the countries with which it's engaging as functioning.
Well, I think India does have a lot of options, and we'll have more in the future. I think India is going to emerge as...
See, Larry, we don't have a military-industrial complex largely because the kinds of things that sustain it in America are the existence of a very, very large private sector defense and arms industry, which so far in India hasn't existed. Our defense manufacturing and arms purchases and so on are all conducted by government, and it's in the public sector. And therefore, you don't have yet enough of a vested interest building up in the industrial complex that has a vested interest in.
But you do have a DPSU, Defence Public Sector Units.
But those are public sector, and therefore ultimately it's a taxpayer. Whereas when, with Mr. Modi's policy, the private sector starts getting into defense, manufacturing, sales, and joint ventures in a big way, I'm sure you will see the emergence of an Indian military-industrial complex, and we might need an Eisenhower-style speech in a couple of decades in India too. But it's just that the two are not in sync.
Meanwhile, the octopus of the national
India doesn't function the way the octopus does because we don't have the same reason for it.
If people think of their questions.
Basevich is a professor up there at BU. He's written several books on the military-industrial state. But Harvard just last night disinvited a person to be a fellow.
Chelsea Benning.
Chelsea Benning, I guess that's her name. I'm so out of the news. If I miss a news cycle, I'm considered inadequate. But I missed the news cycle. But in any event, Chelsea Benning was disinvited by Harvard. But that's the military-industrial state at work, in my judgment. You think Harvard is this big independent institution, and they are very responsive because they get all those grants and all that federal money and all those buildings named after. One step removed, the arms companies and so forth. On the other hand, we need national defense. We need, so this is the dilemma. But this has come to run our country. There are now, I was chairman of a committee, the Commerce Committee, and I was whoever gets that job is expected to raise so much money for his party. So therefore you have to go to the same people you're trying to regulate and ask them for money for the party. And the fellow who's written a book about this over in the House, he was chairman of a couple of subcommittees over there. But this money thing is really, and big picture, I'm a co-sponsor of the thing to limit the amount of money people can give. That amendment is not going to pass. It's not even close. The average citizen could care less. But we've sort of lost our democracy to this system that I try to define. And it's not just in foreign policy. It's and some of the stuff, therefore, is good. We get something done in a lot of areas, and now we're going to have to come up with a lot of money to pay flood victims and so forth. But we're going to see huge deficits, and I think we're going to see a real severe problem in carrying out foreign policy as we have in the past.
Good. Can we have questions, please? One here. And some more, I hope. One over there. 2, 3, 4. Lovely. First one here. Oh, there? Okay.
I'm Seema Sirohi. It's more a comment than a question. I think Trump's new policy towards Afghanistan and Pakistan should be allowed to play out before you dismiss it as a failure. Because I think they are being tough on Pakistan, and they have many other ideas that will come into play. And as for supplying troops, they're being supplied by air more and more, and less through the ground. So that's all I want to say.
Sina, I apologize to you. I left my interview with you because I was dragged in here. But good point.
We've got about 4 questions around here. This gentleman in the front first.
So, as we listen to you all speak, and you all are at the highest levels of policy making, is the world doomed? I mean, are we headed further and further into a space where just narrow interests, sometimes to do with arms and the killing of people, will dominate policy making for the foreseeable future? Or do you see pockets of light and wisdom that might supersede that?
I'm an optimist. I see pockets of light and wisdom, and I think we just have to keep working away and trying to get good people into these positions, and I'm an optimist.
Willie?
I'm an optimist, but I define optimism as looking at the future with uncertainty. The pessimist says everything's bound to go wrong. It's going to go, we're doomed. The optimist says, look, things just might go right if we get it right. Keep trying. I'll keep trying.
Willie?
I'm intrigued by you including centre-left Brookings in this octopus? What have they got? Why are they dependent on arms firms or the military-industrial complex? They seem to be at the opposite end of that spectrum.
Yes. Well, there's a group in Washington called POGO, Public Organization for Good or something like that, governance, and they feel that Brookings is one of the most supported foundations by military companies on the scene. Now, some of this is funneled through other foundations, but that Brookings is very dependent on Pentagon-related companies.
Your point being that they fund various research, and you have people moving into Brookings and out.
And also, I'm not, Brookings has done a lot of good things, but we've got a problem because our Harvard is compromised, our foundations are, you'd think you could go someplace and get an independent opinion, and I'm sure Brookings does a lot, and Strobe Talbot's done a lot of good work. But in terms of, they'd be out of business tomorrow if it weren't for support from arms companies.
Yes, I mean, you talk about Brookings, which is tax-exempt, non-profit organization, systematically engages in a strategy of what it calls high-impact philanthropy, seeking out corporate donors and finding ways to offer them maximum returns on their corporate donations.
Yes, and I name names in my book, and my publisher, Penguin, cut me way back. You know, we don't want to get sued here. So, but I'm not saying that any of these people are bad people. I'm just saying this is the system, and I list some law firms and so on and so forth. But this is what makes, a young person said to me, if they want to be active in foreign policy, what should they do? Should they go join the State Department or Foreign Service? And I said, well, in part, maybe you should join a law firm or a lobbying firm in Washington. That's where the real decisions are made.
Then you move on and say Brookings set up an affiliate organization in India in 2013 run by Vikram Singh Mehta, former chairman of the Shoal Group of Companies. Now, we all know Vikram Mehta in Delhi. We all regard him as a friendly guy who's been around for years, and father was a distinguished foreign secretary. But here you sort of include him in this this list of possible bad men.
Well, no, no, I really don't say any of them are bad.
Corporation. No, I'm
Yeah.
not being too serious on that, and I'm sure Vikram would forgive me. But you talk about the Founders Circle and the 24 corporations who are funding it. So you are, in a way, pulling the Brookings in India into the same net that you have at Brookings in America.
Yes, I would say India is headed down the road, the same road. And by the way, I'm going to speak with, I'm going to meet with Brookings in New Delhi when I'm there in a week or 2 weeks, whenever I'm there. I'm there in Chennai, and I'm meeting with somebody, another group down in Chennai. I don't know if that's a Brookings group. So Brookings does a lot of good, and I hope, but this book, I tried to describe a very serious problem in that how policy is made today in our country, and I think probably India will be adopting the same methods, and I just hope that's not the case. I happen to be watching with my wife The Tudors. Now this is going off the reservation, but Henry VIII and his court, boy, there were a lot of special interests there. So maybe it's not, so maybe I should be optimistic for the future, because we've gotten through it. If men of goodwill, and I'm sure they are, keep working away at it. But I'm very worried about the functioning of the United States government, because we're not functioning as a democracy.
Larry, do you want to say anything on Brookings? I'm sorry, Shashi, do you want to say anything on Brookings?
I'm quite happy. There seem to be lots of hands up there, so let's hear what the audience
question
says.
here.
If I may come back to the issue of nuclear non-proliferation, in light of the experience so far with this treaty and the questionable moral underpinning of the treaty itself, how do you see the future of the treaty? And in particular, how do you see the proliferation efforts for the future? Do you see, in light of what North Korea has done, Japan and South Korea, and then in the Middle East, Iran and Saudi Arabia going nuclear in the coming decade or two? Or what do you want to do at this stage to prevent that?
Well, I mean, I think it's going to be difficult to prevent it unless there is a very serious committed effort on the part of the existing major nuclear powers to give a new impetus to disarmament. If they come and say that in order to underscore our efforts to curb North Korea, Iran, and any future other countries from going nuclear, we will voluntarily start giving up our nukes. But there's absolutely no political constituency for that in either the US or the Soviet Union, or even in Britain and from it. Why do the Brits need nukes? I mean, that's another subject altogether, I guess. But the fact is that, that since they have them and they won't give them up, I don't see any way that you can stop North Korea doing it. And tomorrow Iran may also pull out of the Non-Proliferation Treaty if it feels able to do so. The sanctions were effective enough to bring Iran to heel, but it looks like the Americans are busy trying to shoot themselves in the foot and introduce sanctions so severe that they will completely destroy any Iranian incentives to adhere to the nuclear deal. You may well find de facto proliferation following. So it will, in time to come, be seen as a classic example of a treaty that didn't work because those who adopted it were not sincere in their professions, that they intended to disarm eventually at the end of it. It's their failure to disarm that has encouraged all of this proliferation, no question about it.
And I would just add, I'm very worried about this nuclear thing. In my home state of South Dakota that I represented in Congress for 22 years, some of the silos there, they're renewing the warheads right now, today. And I scratched my head. I thought under non-Lugar we were not going to do that, but apparently we're back to doing that. The point is, it's a drug that the whole world is on, and countries will want to acquire nuclear weapons. And I'm trying to, my last project in life, I'm a 75-year-old guy with bladder cancer, so I might not be around that long, but I want to write a novel about some people stealing or buying, going to Pakistan and buying from the generals or the colonels 5 or 6 nuclear weapons somehow, and driving them out in pickup trucks through the tunnels and taking them to Vietnam and shipping them in a, we buy all this stuff from all these shoes from Vietnam. In my novel, they'll ship them in, over to the United States. So you get several nuclear bombs and some sort of a new international caliphate that would control them. And I think we're in for a very unhappy time that won't be entirely within the traditional nation states or within the traditional treaties, but we really have a severe problem with all the nuclear weapons, and I don't think we're making much progress. And I say that in my book. I admit to it. We tried.
Yes, indeed. Another question here. Here, sorry, this one here.
Oh,
sorry.
Hi. No worries. Fascinating conversation. I am at CU. I am a climate scientist. And for full disclosure, my alma mater is Harvard. So I have to ask this question. You do point out some important vulnerabilities in the system, including the university system. And my pointed question really is, do you think it's fully responsible to say our universities are compromised, Harvard's compromised? Is that a very responsible thing to say?
Well, it's not completely compromised, but everything, all of us are, we have, at the end of the day, who we answer to and what we believe and so forth. So no, I wouldn't say that Harvard is totally compromised, but I didn't agree with them appointing her as a fellow in the first place, but once she's appointed, I think it's really bad that Harvard has withdrawn that.
Do we have another question? Microphone?
Yeah, I'm trying your technique.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Good, excellent.
Just tried your technique. First of all, I really admire the efforts you guys are making. It's very important. But I think there has been a change in paradigm which the politicians don't seem to be aware of, or at least not appreciating, although Mr. Pressler alluded to that. The thing is that nobody has been able to block the progress of science and technology. Now, it's not that, I mean, a big nuclear bomb, of course, takes all the effort. But now, or very soon, a nuclear bomb, a dirty bomb, can be made almost in a college lab. And that kind of, so are you making any effort of studying that and studying the problem coming from there? You can stop a country, okay, Iran or Korea, but not making a big nuclear bomb. But they may be acquiring a small things which can be very, very dangerous. And Mr. Tharoor, in India, is there any effort being made controlling this kind of exchange of information about the dirty bombs made in high school labs? And Mr. Pressler, if you can comment on the general international approach on this, because nobody is talking about these kind of bombs, and which are very dangerous.
The more traditional type of weapons. Well, I agree. I had a conversation with the late Senator John Glenn just before he died, and my book is dedicated in part to Senator Glenn. But he was originally a military man, but he was very fearful of the military industrial state and said that it will cut to the core of our democracy. And I guess that's one of my messages when I talk to college groups, and our universities are not compromised necessarily. I just think that thing where Harvard withdrawing that invitation is just a classic example of the pressure that they get from the outside, and they have to just sheepishly admit that they're not so independent. But, and I think that's a classic example of it. So, yes, Harvard and our universities, but they do a lot of good, and we've got to keep working forward and doing the best we can. But we do have to keep nuclear non-proliferation as one of our goals in the world, and I hope other countries will step up to the plate a lot more.
On the question you asked me, I mean, the fact is that for a very open society, India is extraordinarily good at keeping nuclear secrets. It's held so tightly and so closely by so few people that there's a colossal amount of ignorance about what the capacity is, how much there is, where it's stored, how to access it, and so on. To the extent that in one famous case in the early 90s, a former chief of the army staff wrote a memoir saying he had no idea if India had a nuclear capacity or not. And I asked him in person whether that was just for public consumption. It wasn't. I mean, he was angry that the civilians kept it so tightly controlled. So the fact is that obviously, since then we know because we've tested the bomb, but I don't think the military to this day has much control on its deployment. So the fact is that in these circumstances, we are a long way away from the scenario you fear. But you know, beyond confessing my own ignorance, I just don't know whether the nightmare scenario you're concerned about could happen elsewhere. I think it's far more likely to happen in some other countries than in a place like India.
Let me say that India, I think, has done an admirable job of having a chain of command, and the United States has that chain of command. You know, the President of the United States can't launch a nuclear weapon. He has to get the concurrence of at least 15 other people before he can do that. And that's fairly hard to do. Right off the bat, he has to have the concurrence of the Secretary of Defense and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, plus about 9 others. So, and let me say that this very quickly. I think Pakistan maybe has less good controls. Like I believe, or at least in my novel, I'm going to suggest that several people could go to Pakistan with so many $1 million in cash and buy 2 or 3 nuclear bombs. I said from generals, but Mr. Kapoor here suggested I should use colonels. You could buy it from colonels cheaper because they have the keys to get it out. I don't think Pakistan has a very tight chain of command. There are 3 or 4 different groups of generals who each control different nuclear bombs, and that is much different from India, which has a very clear chain of command, and the United States, which has a very complicated chain of command. They all think President Trump can push a button on his desk or something. It takes 15 people at least to concur.
Before he presses the button.
That's right.
Hope so.
One last quick question.
Hi. So my name is Anjali Bhave, and based on your conversation, it seems like you look at America's rhetoric as being idealistic, but their actions being realistic. When you talk about Clinton or anybody else. Now, for India, which is situated between China and Pakistan and what's going on, what do you see as a change in strategy that is needed going forward on India's part to deal with what's happening, whether it's China, North Korea, Pakistan, and things like that?
To advise the government of India, I would be very hesitant, but I think India has to do what they're doing, be a great country, take care of their minorities, take care of their internal problems, but I would, in my opinion, I do not want to see any more ground troops from any countries sent to places like Afghanistan. I think that era is over. I think it was over when I was in Vietnam with a rifle. I've never met a real Vietnam veteran who's for all these adventures around the world, because they don't work. So I think we'll enter an era, I hope, of peaceful coexistence, to quote Ike, I guess, and we can, if we work at it, we can hope that it will work. Now, these things we've been discussing today are the most difficult parts of foreign policy. This nuclear non-proliferation, Pakistan, India, North Korea. The conversation we're having here would be the toughest class at Harvard in foreign affairs. And there are not easy answers. And we're just going to have to just keep working at them and try to have some guiding principles. And one of them is nuclear non-proliferation at every turn and no boots on the ground from the United States. That's just me talking.
Well, I think that's a great answer, but just to address the issue of India, and I think obviously I tend to think we got it right in the last government, which was to try and enlarge the constituency for peace with both countries, try and make progress on those areas where we can, including trade and as much as possible normal relations in those areas, while keeping our powder dry and in being prepared that we don't seem to be so inattentive to our own defense that we encourage military adventurism on the other side. So as long as they know that any misbehavior on their part will create a very strong reaction from a very capable adversary, they would have no incentive to start trouble with us. And in the meantime, we expand trade, we expand other kinds of contact, cultural exchange, and so on, and hope that eventually the atmosphere between our countries improves to a point where peace is possible. I think that's the right mix. How you conduct that mix, how you calibrate it, that's where the individual quality of those in office comes into play. And obviously, I'm in the opposition today. I have a slightly different perspective on whether we've managed these relations very well in recent years, but that's the way we should do it.
Thank you, Shashi, and thank you. You were about to say something quickly.
Well, I was going to say that in my lifetime, India has come a long way in terms of developing as one of the very most leading nations in the world. India is capable of food export now for the first time. And I remember when they used to buy grain from us. I remember when I first met Murli Diora, a parliamentarian way back in the 70s. He was about the only Congress pro-American member of parliament. All the rest were pro-Russian. And I mean, this is how we sort of divided things up, or when we calculated them. And how much that has changed. And he was criticized for that back then. And his son, Milind, is, I'm going to see him on this trip. But that was way back in the 70s. But to think back, when I think back at that, when we met with the Indian parliamentarians, we calculated who was pro-American and who was pro-Russian. That was pretty pathetic, wasn't it? But anyway, we did.
Thank you both very much.
Now they're often the same people.
We all look forward, Larry, to your novel, hoping that it finishes up with some of the hope that the ending is a happy ending when you write it.
Several years.
Okay, fine. We finished.